Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, a professor at Columbia University, advisor to countries and governments around the world, and a prolific analyst. I'm absolutely sure all of you know him very well. Professor Sachs, welcome back.
Pascal, great to be with you, as always.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And maybe before we go into the larger picture, I would like to get your take on a couple of current affairs. Like we are talking today on May 27th, 2025, and the negotiations, peace negotiations between, let's face it, US and Russia are at a very peculiar point, as yesterday President Trump actually said he doesn't understand Vladimir Putin. How is it possible that he bombed Kiev? What is your take at where these negotiations are at the moment?
I think we should consider the four parties to this war. There's the Russian side, of course. There's the United States. There's Europe, broadly speaking, both the EU and Britain. And there is, of course, Ukraine. So where do the four sides stand on this? The Russians say very clearly, here are the terms for ending this war. Three components: Ukraine's neutrality, security arrangements that are satisfactory, that don't put Russia back into a disadvantage by a Western military presence on Russia's border, and territorial concessions by Ukraine. Ukraine, which doesn't mean the people of Ukraine, but means a martial law government headed by Zelensky, says no to all of that. NATO, no territorial concessions, and no concessions to Russia. So it's not offering, in fact, I should say the Ukrainian peace plan is reparations, war crimes tribunals. It's a total victory plan of Ukraine. The United States, in the person of the President of the United States, says, let's cut a deal. Yes, Ukrainian neutrality. Yes, some territorial concessions. Yeah, we'll figure out something on security. And the position between Trump and the Russian government has not been decisively the same, but not consequentially divergent either. In other words, the Trump and Putin positions are close enough that one could actually find an agreement. But we should understand that the United States political structure is itself divided. So Trump does not have all the power or call all the shots or have the unanimous weight. Congress is belligerent, strongly Russophobic. The U.S. deep state, meaning the CIA, much of the Pentagon, and so forth, is deeply anti-Russian. And so Trump's position faces a lot of internal U.S. opposition as well. There are supposedly 80 senators or so organized by Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut to put on tough sanctions against Russia, because this is the hardline 30-year destroy Russia part of the U.S. politics, and it continues. And Trump hasn't ended that. He continues to face that. Then is the European side. And while there are a few voices in a few small countries, notably Hungary and Slovakia, and many political parties in Europe that say, end the war, this is a disaster for Europe and for Ukraine, the predominant voices, meaning Starmer in the UK, Macron in France, Merz in Germany, and Tusk, the so-called Four Musketeers in Poland, they are saying we support Ukraine 100% including Zelensky's maximal demands. So what we have is a mess. We don't have a convergent process that we should have, because I think that the Putin-Trump line, that there is a reasonable end to this war that serves Ukraine's interests, Russia's interests, Europe's interests, and the U.S. interests, is actually correct. And at the core of that win-win-win-win is Ukraine's neutrality. This has been the cause of the war all along. The U.S. attempt to expand NATO, which ironically the Europeans opposed privately when it was first presented. But now the Europeans are the great champions of this because Zelensky champions this. We should understand, though, every moment when we say Zelensky, we're talking about a kind of dictatorship. We're talking about military rule of a small group that is not tested at all against the real interests of the Ukrainian people, or the vote by the Ukrainian people, or the opinion surveys of the Ukrainian people. So my view is Trump has been on the right track, but he's opposed within his own team by people like General Kellogg, by Marco Rubio, and by others who are much more mainstream, Russophobic parts of the U.S. political structure, which has been the way U.S. politics has been for many, many decades, even before 1991, going back to 1945 at least. The U.S. has been anti-Soviet and anti-Russia, and Trump hasn't overcome that. So we're a bit paralyzed, except on the battlefield. People are dying in large numbers, and Russia's taking more territory. Then you have the really kind of sadly preposterous scenario of the past week, where Ukraine sent hundreds and hundreds of drones to attack Moscow and other Russian cities. And when Russia retaliated, the president of the United States wrote that Putin's absolutely crazy. This is an absurdity. Anyone that steps back beyond the immediacy of the moment and even looks within the context of a week understands that the provocation comes from both sides, and that the fundamental problem is no compromise in the Western side other than what Trump has tried to put forward against the opposition of European leaders, and against the opposition of his own deep state, and against the opposition of much of the U.S. political class, which is really a military-industrial backed class. So all of this means great disappointment. Trump could have the upper hand if he's consistent. He is the president of the United States. He has the authority to make U.S. foreign policy. But when he posts something like Putin is absolutely crazy, the statement of the last 24 hours, this is not only a little bit bizarre, but very sad and alarming, because it shows how easy it is for the warmongering side in the West to keep up its 30-year anti-Russia campaign.
Yeah, but isn't it also just a textbook example of how difficult it is for two nations to make peace? Because even though you have a moment when the top doves, and let's face it, Trump and Putin are doves, even when they want to cooperate, they face their own opposition, and Trump might have to cater, at least in his speeches, toward the people who now accuse him of being soft on Russia, right? And on the other hand, in Russia, even just one rogue officer flying a drone into a Ukrainian civilian infrastructure building can then give the other hawks enough fodder in order to say, like, we need to escalate, we need to escalate. The reason why I think Vladimir Putin gave a 2:30 a.m. speech in which he proposed the Istanbul Agreement, I think, was to make sure that the Europeans were in bed while the Americans were still awake, in order to sidestep the Europeans, who are also hawks and want to continue the war. Do you see any way in which these factions still could lead to a at least beneficial process, not a peace agreement, but at least a process that leads to more reconciliation?
Well, look, we know that getting to peace requires skill. So it's not a simple matter, because there are always opponents of peace. If there were not, Jesus would not have had to say, "Blessed are the peacemakers." It would have been obvious. But the fact of the matter is, peacemakers face huge opposition. Well, not even, John F. Kennedy said it's much easier to be a warmonger in politics than it is to be an emissary of peace. And Kennedy faced this issue actually repeatedly. And the circumstances that you describe, where the two leaders want to make peace, but the politics around them is much more warmongering, is familiar. But leaders have the job of making the peace. That's their job assignment. Well, what else are they good for? In other words, Trump has to prevail in this. That's his job. It's easy to say, well, I'm under pressure of Lindsey Graham, and I'm under pressure of all these neocons, and I'm under pressure of the military-industrial complex. But his job is actually to make the peace. And for me, maybe one of many historical analogies that's worthwhile is the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy and Khrushchev wanted to avoid nuclear war, in fact, nuclear Armageddon, but their advisors on both sides were very hawkish. Kennedy's advisors, almost to a person in the early days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, go bomb the Russians, go bomb the military bases in Cuba, invade Cuba. There were almost no voices of peace. So Kennedy had a two-level game that he was playing, one with his own government, and the other was with Khrushchev. He was extraordinarily skilled, and he was able to make an agreement with the Soviet side, and the world was saved as a result of that. The point I'm making is that Trump actually can prevail, or to use Trump's words, he holds the cards. He cannot be overwhelmed by Lindsey Graham or by Richard Blumenthal or by Starmer or by Macron. If Trump is consequent, he can make a peace with Putin, which is to Ukraine's advantage. I just have to say, when I say these things, people jump up and down, Putin apologist and so forth. This is so absurd at this stage in end of May 2025. Ukraine has been destroyed by this war. I said it from the beginning that Ukraine would be destroyed by this war, that hundreds of thousands or a million plus would be dead or gravely injured, that the infrastructure, the economy would be destroyed. And for what? For nothing. Because the agreement that was on the table in April 2022 in the Istanbul process was far better than Ukraine's going to get right now. And the agreement that was on the table in December 2021 that President Putin put to Biden, who I think was one of our most incompetent presidents, was vastly better than what's on the table right now. So this isn't about Putin apology. This is about a basic fact, Pascal, that I would like to reiterate strongly. Those who say they're friends of Ukraine are either stupid or cynical, because they're destroying Ukraine. They're leading Ukraine to its death. And I mean that physically. I mean that in terms of lives lost. I mean that in terms of politics. These friends of Ukraine telling Ukraine to fight on and we'll give you the weapons and so forth. They don't have the weapons. They're going to lose on the ground and they're going to lose their country. And I would put Biden as this great friend of Ukraine that did the most destruction. But then I would put the British in an unending line of stupidity, I have to say. Just, I can't stand watching British geopolitics because it's the nostalgia of imperial cynicism every day when they have no empire anymore, but they still have the cynicism and they still have the nostalgia, and telling Ukraine to fight on as if that's the friendly thing to do with Ukraine. That's what's happening right now. Bottom line for me, Trump can make the deal. Trump can end this war, but not if he tweets on one side that Putin's absolutely crazy. He should be explaining to the American people that, look, there is so much Russophobia and belligerence that even I, Donald Trump, am trying to stop the war. There are warmongers everywhere. That's what Trump needs to be explaining. That's what John Kennedy explained to the American people in his famous peace speech in June 1963, that it's our own attitudes which are blocking peace with the Soviet Union. And this is what Trump needs to explain to the American people, and he needs to tell the Europeans, stop barking. Just stop already. Stop the warmongering. You're killing Ukraine, so stop. This is what he needs to say.
I'm absolutely with you. You're completely right. The thing that we now need to discuss, though, is why this is so extremely hard. Because on the one hand, we have Donald Trump who says this. He actually says, I want to stop the war. We need to stop the war. We need to stop the bleeding. He actually says it. On the other hand, he says then other things. But and the media picks out what it actually portrays and what not, right? And, you know, the Europeans, it's even worse than the British. I watched all of these German TV shows, and the Germans, to this day, they think that having a peace agreement with Ukraine, with Russia on Russian terms, is equal to give them a benefit, is equal to giving them something. It's not that Europe and America are unable to impose. It's that the Europeans still view themselves as the arbiters of what can be given, what is right and what is wrong. They view Russia as a little child that is misbehaving, and they themselves as the adults. And
this is exactly right, by the way. There's an incredible anachronism of ideas. Again, the British, to my mind, are shocking. They lost the empire 80 years ago. Would you stop already? But they don't get that. It's like the Monty Python skit where the knight gets the arms cut off and the legs cut off and everything's fine and he's going to keep fighting on. But it's Europe too, the same way. And I think it is, Pascal, honestly, if you try to understand how bizarre the situation is right now, when there is an off-ramp to a peace that actually works and the Europeans won't take it. It is this deep mindset of dominance that goes back hundreds of years that still prevails, because fundamentally what's wrong is arrogance, American arrogance and European arrogance.
But it's also the indoctrination. They ended up believing their own lies. They believe that they still have escalation dominance when they are not. They believe the media narrative. And this links me to the next question, which is the narrative shifts. In Israel, I think we are seeing some form of narrative shift now. In Ukraine, we haven't seen it. And this indoctrination is so strong that it leads people into suicide. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that what is true both in the Middle East and in the Ukraine war is that there are very, very deep currents that are hard to move or to reset. So both in the Middle East and in Ukraine, we're watching processes that have decades of deep roots to them. Even centuries, actually. In the case of the Middle East, this is a war of the Zionists on Palestine that goes back before the state of Israel. It's basically a 100 years war. And it doesn't really change decisively, even when you watch a genocide day by day on TikTok, which is a horrific reality of our time. This deep current still doesn't change because even till today, this murderous regime in Israel has US and European backing. They can't even bring themselves to say this is wrong. Of course, it's a little bit changing. There's a little bit of a shift, but my God, we're years into this flattening of Gaza, this mass murder that's going on, and they can't find the words because this is a colonial project that's more than 100 years old, and it's very deep, and it's very much entrained, and it's very much part of European and U.S. politics, and it's very much part of narratives, and it's very much part of the rhetoric and the propaganda. When it comes to Ukraine and Russia, it's basically the same. The Russophobia is very deep set. In Britain, the Russophobia dates 185 years, roughly, to around 1840. Since that time, with the exception and even partial exception of 1939 to 1945, Britain has been rabidly Russophobic. And that is during the Tsarist period, it's during the Bolshevik period, it's during the Soviet period, and it's during the post-Soviet period. It doesn't really depend on the Russian regime, or certainly it isn't about communism. It's about Russia. And it goes back, and that's why we had the Crimean War. That's why we've had many expeditionary disasters by the British. The British viewed Russia as a competitor to the British Empire, pure and simple, and they still view Russia in these terms. And Starmer and Boris Johnson and others think they're Lord Palmerston, Admiral Nelson or whoever else, balancing in Europe and saving Europe from this massive power. And it's so anachronistic, so much propaganda and cliche, but it gets repeated. So I think what we see is how hard it is to break free of the past. And this past is very deeply set, and we live as prisoners of the past. And presidents can change things. They have the authority to change things. They need a lot of stamina, skill, and attention. And I think that's really what's missing right now. Trump is overwhelmed by events. He's got unpopularity at home politically. He opened up this trade war with essentially the entire world. He's got crises in the Middle East. He's got crises in Ukraine. He's got crises with China. He's got big budget deficits at home. He's trying to pass a piece of legislation, which is pretty awful. So if it passes, it's going to pass by a vote or two because it's a kind of oligarchic, high wealth budget program, which doesn't have popular support and which gives continued tax breaks for the rich by cutting the health benefits of the poorest Americans. So Trump's attention span to this is very, very small, and his team is small and divided. And so it's kind of winging it, actually. These are not carefully planned policies. This is improv, hour to hour, and it's improv of an overloaded system. And that's why you see Trump changing by the hour. Who gets to him? Which advisor? Who makes these tweets? The world's not in stable hands almost anywhere.
I keep wondering if this would be a moment, for the Chinese to insert themselves and say, like, maybe we can help to breach the deadlock. Because at the moment, it really seems on all fronts, also when it comes to the Iran negotiations, the Ukraine negotiations, the what happened, in Yemen, that the United States is stuck at every single front it is at
That
the
is
moment.
correct. This is exactly right. The institution charged with this that actually could do this is the UN Security Council. Sounds bizarre, but this isn't a case where the US and Russia are at each other's throats. Quite the contrary. They're trying to solve this thing. And China is a third of the 5 permanent members, and China wants this thing solved. China won't go freelancing. It's not its style, its capacity, or its interest. So China's not going to go freelancing in this. But the UN Security Council is a proper venue. It's just been so atrophied and weakened over many, many years that the council doesn't have the idea that they have a responsibility to sit down and seriously try to figure this out. So the mindset is missing. I've tried to suggest repeatedly, take up these issues in the Security Council, solve them. It's good that you have Russia, the US, China, and Britain and France. That's a little anachronistic, but fine. They're in the room together. Now solve this thing. I've said it should be like the Roman conclave, which we just observed. Put them into the Security Council chamber, lock the door, and tell them when we see white smoke coming out of the 38th floor that we know that peace has been achieved. In other words, it's your homework assignment to actually solve this thing. And you don't get your weekends until you actually solve this thing. So this is what is missing. Again, let me emphasize that if Trump has the attention span, he has the power to end both the Ukraine war and the Middle East. And the reason is that ultimately Ukraine depends entirely on the US, and Israel depends entirely on the United States. This is just a hard fact. Starmer and Macron and others can jump up and down and say how powerful and wonderful Europe is, and they'll take up the gap if the U.S. Doesn't come through, but they can't, and they wouldn't. So what they're trying to do is to bring Trump back into the fold, and that they're having some success on that because Trump is surrounded by people who say, Putin's your enemy, Putin's your enemy. And he doesn't have time, and he needs votes for other things, and he's got many crises on his plate. So to my mind, it's a matter of skill. It's a matter of attention span. It's a matter of resolve and perseverance. But actually, Trump could make peace both in Ukraine and in Israel because the U.S. is the critical player that keeps these wars going in both cases.
You're absolutely right. And we are nearing the hard end that we have to do. But one last thing, and you can answer very, very shortly. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, what do you read on a daily basis in order to keep up to date? What's the news outlets that you recommend, one or two?
Basically, I read across all sources. So Chinese newspapers, Russian newspapers, U.S. newspapers, European newspapers. And then I'm lucky to be able to speak with people because I work in diplomatic circles for the UN. So I, on a daily basis, speak with people from different parts of the world. The truth is, if you rely only on your own national coverage, it's hopeless. The U.S. media is, in the mainstream, almost nothing but propaganda. The New York Times, you read to cry or for humor, but not for facts. It's pathetic, I have to say. It just hasn't covered these stories with any accuracy at all. And they don't even understand how inaccurate they are, but they rely on unnamed sources that have agendas. And then they naively repeat these agendas, or maybe not naively repeat them. But the only way you can get at the truth is to triangulate, meaning that you're trying to understand an issue from many points of view. and to hear the different points of view. Of course, the way that media works and the way our digital world works is you can tune in to just what you want to hear, and everybody's got their favorite channel, and they don't hear the contrary. But what is important for ascertaining the facts and the deeper realities is to hear the multiple perspectives. It's also, by the way, why diplomacy is essential. And by diplomacy, I mean you actually sit down and talk with the other side. So just to conclude, I'll say, if you want to know how pathetic Europe is, and I mean pathetic in its statecraft, there hasn't been a European leader speaking with Putin for years in a serious way right now, and they don't even get that that's what they should be doing. They have their 100th or 1,000th meeting with Zelensky for some photo op that's usually an absurd one, but they don't reach out to their Russian counterparts to say, let's figure this out. And to my mind, that by itself is evidence of how pathetic European statecraft is right now.
Absolutely true. Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely great to be with you. See you soon.